Whenever there's war and conflict across the globe, I often wonder about my counterparts, because they're almost never seen in news coverage about people with disabilities. There's no shortage of reports and interviews about how wars affect the soldiers, civilians from the elderly, mothers, children, and babies. Though important, even infrastructure and animals get more coverage than what is going on with people with disabilities and how they are affected by what's going on. Whenever a conflict or war breaks out, my thoughts automatically go to the children and people with disabilities and how they will be affected. The current attacks on Ukraine are no exception, as I listen for reports, and like in most conflicts, very little if anything is seen or heard about them, except for when it's about an aid organization evacuating them, and nothing about those who are trapped and cannot be evacuated. Questions run through my head, like if they have caregivers, did the caregivers leave them to fend for themselves? Are they getting food, water, and their medication? I know if it were me, I can't go without vital pain medication, because I'd be begging to be put out of my misery once and for all after just a day. In my search for information on the plight of people with disabilities in Ukraine, I could only find a few dozen articles and television news segments by major networks, newspapers, and magazines out of the thousands upon thousands of articles about the war. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of reports about animals and how they're being affected and being evacuated from the area than about people with disabilities. Most of the reports I've been able to find about the 2.7 million Ukrainians with disabilities are on small charity and organization sites. There are 41.5 million Ukrainians in total, and there's practically no information on a little over 15% of the population, with 1/3 of them are reported to be trapped. You'd think there would be more than a few dozen articles and news segments about them. The lives of people with disabilities weren't all that great before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to a 2015 report on Ukrainians with disabilities, Ukraine was going against the global trend of assisting children with disabilities to integrate into society and force them into institutions. It is said that these institutions are rife with neglect, physical and sexual abuse. And parents were often pressured by the government to institutionalize their children, because it was the cheaper option for the state to do so. Even in the SR modern times, before the war, Ukrainians with disabilities were invisible. When the war is over and the world helps Ukraine rebuilds, let's not help them rebuild. It is clear that international organizations were woefully unprepared to deal with this crisis as they scramble to help people with disabilities. In researching this topic, I was surprised to find the number of GoFundMes to evacuate people with disabilities by small organizations servicing people with disabilities in other parts of the world. I don't place blame on any one individual or entity, I place blame on the government and the Oral Society of Ukraine for not keeping up with the times, by opening more institutions and pressuring parents to put their children in them, rather than providing a little support to keep them home with their families. Maybe if they had, more could have been evacuated with their families by now and would stood a better chance of being moved out of harm's way. Major international organizations like the Red Cross are ill-equipped or not at all equipped to evacuate people with disabilities from disaster areas around the world. And funding for evacuating the disabled and taking care of their needs afterwards is often left up to crowdfunding. Most existing aid and settlement resources are not inclusive. For example, some border checkpoints to register refugees are not accessible to wheelchairs. With large portions of Ukrainians with disabilities are living in institutions, and the Russians are targeting hospitals and institutions in cities with reports of staff abandoning them, it makes it all the more difficult to get information about their living conditions. Even with accurate information, very little can be done due to the lack of inclusivity in disaster planning. You can be an advocate for the Ukrainians and other people with disabilities by writing to major aid organizations like the Red Cross, United Nations, and your local representatives, informing them of the need for more inclusive evacuation planning. Tell your community about THISM and donate to groups who aid specifically people with disabilities in disasters like Fight for Right. And if you're able to do it, sponsor and host a Ukrainian with disability and their family and spread the word about their plight.